When God asks for your last meal, the widow's impossible choice. The sun blazed over the land of Zarephath, its heat pressing down like the weight of an unseen hand. The famine had stretched for months, and every well, every granary, every storehouse had long since run dry. Crops had withered, livestock had fallen, and desperation had settled over the people like a suffocating fog. A widow stood near the city gate, gathering dry sticks. Her hands trembled with weakness, and her eyes were hollow from hunger. She had just enough flour left to make a final meal for herself and her son, a last supper before starvation claimed them both. But as she picked up another stick, a voice interrupted her thoughts. "Excuse me, would you bring me a little water in a cup?" She turned and saw a man, his clothes dusty, his face weathered. Something about him seemed different. His presence carried weight, though she could not explain why. She nodded and started to fetch the water when his voice called out again. "And bring me a piece of bread as well." She froze. Bread. Did he not understand? Did he not see the frail state of her body or the weariness in her soul? She turned back to him and spoke the painful truth. "As surely as the Lord your God lives, I have no bread. Only a handful of flour in a jar and a little oil in a jug. I'm gathering sticks to prepare a final meal for my son and me that we may eat and die." She expected him to walk away, to perhaps murmur his condolences. But instead he spoke words that should have sounded absurd. "Do not fear. Go and do as you have said. But first, make me a small loaf of bread and bring it to me. Then make something for yourself and your son. For this is what the Lord, the God of Israel, says. The jar of flour shall not be spent, and the jug of oil shall not run dry, until the day the Lord sends rain on the land." A step of faith. The widow stared at the man. His words challenged everything her instincts told her. Give away her last meal? Feed a stranger before her child? It was madness, yet something about him, about his confidence, his certainty, stirred something deep within her. Could it be true? Could this God of Israel, a God she barely knew, really sustain them? She took a breath and turned toward her home. With hands still trembling, she measured out the last of her flour, poured the last drops of oil, and kneaded the dough. As she placed the bread on the fire, her heart pounded in her chest. This was a test, an impossible choice. And yet, as the aroma of the baking bread filled the small home, a strange peace settled over her. She took the bread to the man. Elijah, he had called himself. He received it with a nod, then gestured for her to look inside her flour jar. Her heart stopped. The flour was still there. She rushed to the jug of oil. It, too, had not run dry. Her breath caught in her throat. It had not run out. It had not run out. The miraculous provision. From that day forward, the widow's household never lacked food. Each morning she found flour in the jar and oil in the jug. No matter how much she used, it remained. The impossible had become her reality. Yet, this was more than just a miracle of sustenance. It was a divine lesson. She had given in faith, and God had provided. She had chosen obedience, and God had responded with abundance. But faith is never a one-time act. It is a continual surrender, a refining fire. And soon, her faith would be tested again. One evening, the widow heard a sound that made her blood run cold, a ragged cough from the next room. Her son. His face was pale, his breath shallow. He had fallen ill, and his condition worsened by the hour. She did everything she could. She prayed, she held him, she whispered words of comfort. But as the night stretched on, the unthinkable happened. Her son took his final breath. A cry tore from her throat. She clutched his lifeless body, grief swallowing her whole. The very God who had provided for them had now allowed death to steal her child. The miracle had sustained them. Only for this? She turned on Elijah, anger and sorrow mingling in her voice. "What do you have against me, man of God? Did you come to remind me of my sin and kill my son?" Elijah's face was stricken with sorrow. He did not argue. Instead, he gently lifted the boy's body from her arms and carried him to the upper room. Elijah laid the boy on the bed and stretched himself over him 3 times, crying out, "Lord, my God, let this boy's life return to him." Silence, then a breath. The boy gasped, his chest rising, his eyes fluttering open. Life had returned. Elijah carried him back downstairs and placed him into his mother's arms. "See, your son is alive." Tears streamed down her face as she clutched her child. But more than joy, something else filled her heart. Certainty. "Now I know that you are a man of God, and that the word of the Lord from your mouth is the truth." The story of the widow of Zarephath is not just about miraculous provision. It is a shadow of something greater. Every detail whispers the name of Jesus, the bread that never runs out. Just as God provided flour and oil daily, Jesus declared, "I am the bread of life. Whoever comes to me shall not hunger." John 6:35. The widow's jar never emptied, just as Christ's grace never runs dry. The ultimate sacrifice. The widow was asked to give her last meal before seeing the miracle. Likewise, Christ calls us to surrender all before experiencing the fullness of his kingdom. Matthew 16:24-25. Resurrection power. The raising of the widow's son foreshadows the resurrection of Jesus, the greatest miracle of all. Just as Elijah cried out for life to return, so too did Christ conquer death itself. Faith requires risk. The widow had to step out in faith before she saw provision. In our lives, God often asks us to trust him with what little we have before he multiplies it. Whether it's our finances, time, or talents, true faith means stepping forward even when we can't see the outcome. 2 Corinthians 5:7. God's provision is daily. The flour and oil were replenished each day, not all at once. This teaches us to depend on God daily, rather than hoarding resources out of fear. "Give us this day our daily bread," Matthew 6:11, reminds us that trust is built in the daily walk, not in stockpiling safety nets. If you've gotten any value out of our time together, then smash that like button and don't forget to share and subscribe. Thank you for watching, and we'll see you next time.